Hi. Well, this is the day that science fiction truly goes global, folks. And I want to welcome everyone from here to Cairo to this meeting. And we're so pleased we have a truly international group today. And we have two excellent speakers. I just see one of the people coming in now. Um, the speakers are Gerry Canavan, who is at Marquette University and he's also an officer, I believe, the president of the SFRA. If I get that wrong, you can correct me. And also the co-editor of Global Science Fiction. And Gerry will be talking about, what the scope and the mission of Global Science Fiction, a book series, is, and some other interesting angles that he wants to cover. Our other speaker is Professor Sonja Fritzsche, who is not only a German professor, but very big into science fiction. She's the co-editor of Global Science Fiction and is also going to present on a couple of Eastern European, East German science fiction writers. And I'll let her do all the details on that. So we're so pleased to have them this morning. As people are coming in, a few at a time, I think that we didn't finish all of our introductions to ourselves. We can do that right after during Q&A. So I will now move through our business slides. And when we're going to have these speakers, sometimes it gets a little bit bad about, I'm going to turn off my video, in fact, right now. We don't have enough bandwidth sometimes, so it's good to turn off your video and your microphone while the presentation is going on. Place your comments that we can take up in Q&A in the chat window. And that works very well. And I will promise to look back and find anyone's questions, because you can even make questions in chat during the talk. So if you want more information on the speakers, you can contact me and our group at this email address. And something else. Oh, and if you want to get on the list, our e-alert list, our e-list. So I'm trying to go to the next page here. Let's see if it will work. And right now, page down. Oh, there we go. The group that has grown out of our group is the Planet Zoom players. And you can go to the Hard Science SF channel. And usually I give the link to it in almost every communication. If you just go to our club channel by looking at the recording of this meeting, you can find it in a list, all the different offerings that we have. We only have 3 plays at the moment. We have Rock the Nuclear Clock, which is something about the doomsday clock, and a futuristic game show that solves the nuclear war problem. The second one is The Crystal Egg by H.G. Wells, and that was very well animated by Phil Nichols, who's over in the UK. He was acting as our tech and animations person. And the third one they're working on is Lee Brackett's The Terror Out of Space. So let's move on here. Oh, I guess maybe I went to the end. Okay, so I will stop that share and now allow our speakers to share their.
Now you're gone. That's odd.
So is my voice okay? Can everybody hear me? I got
Yeah.
disconnected for a second. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
And it's a stupid mistake over here.
I presume she'll sign back in a moment, so I can get started. I'm going to get out of your way pretty fast, so you can have the main event in Sonja's presentation. My name is Gerry Canavan. I am a professor, and currently I'm the chair of the English department at Marquette University. I teach a number of science fiction related classes. I teach a comic book class. I teach a game studies class. Right now I'm teaching a J.R.R. Tolkien class that we teach every couple of years because we are improbably the holder of J.R.R. Tolkien's papers. And with Sonja, I am the co-editor of the series she founded, Peter Lang, World Science Fiction Studies. She is the vision behind it. I really feel like I'm very much the vice president in this equation. The series has had 2 volumes come out so far. The first volume was titled Fantastic Worlds, an Australian Aboriginal Fiction by Eva Pollack, and the second, Science Fiction Circuits of the South and East, which was an edited collection by Anindita Banerjee and Sonja. We have a third book coming out. The picture and stuff is up on the website, although I didn't feel like I had permission to share it, so I'm just going to read from it. It's from a Chinese scholar who was studying in London named Wu Zhangzhao. It's called The Boom and the Boom, and it's about comparing the boom in science fiction in Britain in the 1980s to the Chinese science fiction boom also in the late 1980s, and kind of contextualizes the 2 booms within what's going on in that moment in both countries around the Thatcher administration in England and the Zhao Jing administration in China. It's a kind of perfect encapsulation of what we're trying to do with the series. The goal of the series is to not just kind of bring in texts from other parts of the world besides the American and the Anglosphere, but also kind of new approaches, right? New ways of thinking about science fiction that aren't so West-centric. We have some other really exciting projects in the works. Our contest winner a couple of years ago wrote a really interesting dissertation on African futurism and eco-criticism that we're hoping to see in the series really soon. We have a couple edited collections in the works, and we're working, Sonja, myself, and a number of other people, on an edited collection that's pretty specifically about that question of world SF and how to conceptualize it.
Gerry,
Yeah.
could I interrupt just a minute? I think for some people who are just at ground zero, I almost didn't catch that about African. Can you slow it down, your delivery just slightly
Oh, sure.
for the newbies? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So African futurism is science fiction written in Africa for global consumption, but kind of specifically speaking to African concerns. It's a term that Nnedi Okorafor coined to kind of match what's often called Afrofuturism in the U.S., right? Black SF. And so this was just a really interesting book that we're really excited about. We have founded, kind of under Sonja's leadership, a research community that kind of moves between a number of academic conferences. We've been at the International Conference for the Fantastic and the Arts, which is the big science fiction conference that meets in Florida every year. We have met a few times at the Science Fiction Research Association. That's the organization where I'm the immediate past president, and Sonja was vice president when I was president, and so we've met a few times there. Our next meeting is at ACLA, the American Comparative Literature Association, and we are having a meeting to kind of talk about World SF and some of these terms. What does it mean? Why do we say it? What are we attracted to when we're attracted to World SF? And what are kind of the pitfalls of the way we approach it? I just wanted to read our little CFP because the portal goes online next week. And so if anybody watching is an academic or interested in participating, I'd love to talk to you more about it maybe after the meeting. So here's what we're working on, kind of building towards an edited collection to go in the series someday. In its journals and on its syllabi, the field of science fiction studies becomes ever more international in its scope. But significant challenges persist in the way the U.S. Academy approaches texts from outside the U.S. and the U.K. How have we settled on the singularized category of world SF as a concept that encompasses the futurological imaginings of billions of human beings scattered across the globe? How, for that matter, did world ever come to signify the opposite of America in the first place? How can we resist the various hierarchies that are implicit in its division of the world in such uneven halves? How can our work better appreciate the specific histories and contexts that have gone into the creation and evolution of local science fiction traditions? And how can it better reflect the truly planetary nature of SF? The seminar invites presentations of all kinds that take up new approaches to teaching, researching, and otherwise navigating the vast field of texts that are currently commonly grouped under the umbrella term World SF. Participants might take up questions of selection, canonization, and tokenization, strategies for managing the uneven availability and distribution of global texts, especially literature and translation, strategies for engaging texts from non-US and non-UK contexts in ways that don't replicate empirical hierarchies or West centrism, and that do not flatten vast cultures and traditions into kind of racially homogenous groups. Proposals for new terminology, theorizations, and proposed periodizations. Explorations of core text methods and thinkers that can help us to think about this category of world SF in new ways, and much more. And one thing we're really interested in is submissions that help us kind of rethink the colonial nature of a lot of discussion around SF. Thinking about fantasy, folklore, fairy tale, and myth in new ways, as well as submissions that can help us rethink what science fiction can do by drawing on non-Western and non-colonial approaches to the mind, science, ethics, community values, and spiritual traditions, right? So anybody who's watching or anybody who's interested, you can send me an email. I'm super easy to find on the web, and I'd love to tell you more. That's ACLA at the end of May. Nice thing about it, one of the nice things that's come out of the pandemic that this group really embodies is that we're all getting used to doing this over Zoom, and we can have these kind of amazing global conversations across time zones and across regions together. So that's what ACLA is trying to do with its conference. So it'll be super easy for anybody who wants to attend. So that's it. That's it from me. I'm really here to do so.
Gerry, I appreciate so much that you read that statement. It was very moving for me to read it, that because Forry Ackerman, struggled with that whole colonialization. And one reminder, you can put your email in the chat, so people can just cut and paste it, and they may do it immediately. And also a reminder, everyone at the end, I'll remind you to save chat, because I saw Sonja was very diligently putting a lot of links. So, okay. And thank you so much. I'm just so thrilled to have you here. And now for our second speaker, who's also working on this project. There you go. I'm handing it off to Sonja.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to say briefly, when you raised the topic of Forry Ackerman, Gloria, you just got me so excited, because I have, and I'll introduce myself in just a minute, but I have a wonderful vicarious memory, I think, about Forry Ackerman, because one of the first people I met in graduate school when I was studying in Berlin and studying East German science fiction and meeting people over there and meeting fans and meeting authors, really told me a story about how she had traveled to the United States. Well, I should say how Forry had come to Berlin. And this person is my age, a little bit older than me. So I think this probably would have been in the late 80s, the 90s, somewhere around in there. I'm not entirely sure. But they had met with him. He had met with fans and authors, and who was there to meet in Berlin at that time. And I'm not sure whether it was during when the Berlin Wall was still up, whether I assume he would have gone over to the east as well. It was certainly possible for him to do that. But then my friend Anita Winkler is her name. She had then traveled to the United States, and when Forry had met them in Germany, he had said, "Visit me if you're ever in Los Angeles." Well, my friend took that very seriously, and when they were in Los Angeles, found his address and knocked on his door. And he opened it and just was so excited to see them and welcomed them with open arms. And they had a wonderful visit. And so, I wanted to mention that because I think that's just a wonderful demonstration of his outreach that I would, love. I think you were going to maybe later have some more stories about that. But I wanted to talk about how it was really kind of coming full circle then as well. So I just wanted to share that first.
Could I do the Forry thing? It's just 10 slides. And
Would love to have you do that if you want.
Because
Yeah,
this series is actually dedicated to him. He was a dear, dear family friend of ours. And I have to revise his Wikipedia page because they've left all this out. And I know how to edit Wikipedia. So I will be putting some of this in. I don't know if it was by accident or by design, because, some people are quite happy with the way things have been. All right. So if you don't mind, way it's all contiguous with his, what he did for science fiction. So let me find Forry tribute. Here it is. And share that. And it won't take more than 10 minutes or so. And everything's a bit slow because when you have on an old computer several things running, sometimes it takes a while. And it's thinking, okay, so can you all see this?
Yes.
You can unmute everyone
Yes.
in order to say, yes, I
Yes.
can. I
Yes.
almost got
Yes, yes,
Okay,
we
good.
can.
Okay, good. Well, here we go with Forry Ackerman, the Goodwill ambassador, sort of like Danny Kaye was so famous for being in the 50s, going around the world. My experience with Forry is that he had this vision, and it was that you can cover so much more than you can do in a lifetime. And I love this. I'm paraphrasing, it's not precise, but he said this is what he said. And that's what made his sense of wonder, which he really had, grow. And of course, anyone with a sense of wonder isn't going to want to be into little clans and warring factions and packs. So his 1940-ish fanzine was called VOM, and that stood for the Voice of the Imagi-Nation, Voice of the Imagination, or Imagi-Nation. And he said, that's the nation that I'm interested in. So Forry's story began in 1916 in Los Angeles. His grandpa Wyman had been an architect who was young, and he was plucked from obscurity as a young draftsman level architect when some wealthy, he was a lumber guy, lumber baron, and he saw him sketching. And this man was going to build the Bradbury building downtown. And I guess his name was Bradbury. And so this futuristic design of building that has been a setting for many films, including Blade Runner, was built. And so Forry's grandfather was fairly comfortable in circumstances. And he had the best relationship with that pair of grandparents. He said they were the best kind, and they took him to silent movies like Phantom of the Opera and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. He said he went to 7 movies one day with his grandparents. By the way, that is one of my paintings of Jekyll and Hyde. So I can't use the copyrighted things, so I'm using my art in several places. But anyway, he was so happy that he had these grandparents, and he said they raised him right. So by the 1930s, he was a very gregarious man, and he had been reading science fiction and found out that at this one cafe, and I think it was called Clifton's or something in downtown LA, they were already starting to meet. And it was called Los Angeles Science Fiction Society. And he met Ray Bradbury there, Ray Harryhausen, and many others. And Ray Bradbury wanted to go to the 1939 Worldcon. That was the very first one, but he was poor, and his family were poor in the Depression. So Forry helped him to go. And that set up some contacts for Ray Bradbury. Forry collected so many movie props, posters, and manuscripts, film scripts, that his collection was the biggest in the world at one point. He was also a literary agent, and he started Perry Rhodan, for good or ill, in the US, which had been a huge, huge sort of a Doctor Who phenomenon in Germany. Forry's story went on. He met his wife, Matilda Warman, in a bookstore in Los Angeles, and I believe that she was of a Jewish descent, and she had fled from the anti-Semitism in Hitler's Germany. I don't remember the name of the bookstore. But the sad part, they had a good long life together, but the sad part is they were going to a fan event in Rome, and she was counting out money in a taxi cab, and some guy came up in a Vespa motorbike with a lead pipe, jabbed it into her side, and she never recovered from the effects of that. So that's Forry after she died. He had this huge picture of her. So she was a translator, and she made the West German Perry Rhodan huge science fiction series of novels known in the US. And Forry was the one with his connections to set up the publication. And so that was a big service to the German world of science fiction. But Forry didn't stop there. he had this very important thing to say about war. And that started in the Battle of the Bulge. Forry was stateside. I don't think he ever did anything in Europe during World War II, but his brother Aldi, his only brother, died in the Battle of the Bulge. So Forry really decided that this would shape his life. He never was crazy about extreme nationalisms and factions and war. So he began to travel around Europe, and he met science fiction fans on all sides. He didn't stop at the fabled, Cold War walls. He also recommended Esperanto to people. And there are problems, as Sonja knows, with Esperanto, but for lay people like Forry, it was the best attempt to find a language that people didn't hate each other over. And so he would go around. He tried to get me to learn Esperanto, and I was so busy, I'm sorry to say, I didn't do much with it. Since he has gone to that great Prince Serkis castle in the sky, that's the way he used to describe it from Death Takes a Holiday. Prince Serki was the embodied death. You can find Forry's archive of papers at Syracuse University. And I'm giving you a list of, I pulled some names just so you could see how many people he knew from all of these countries in Eastern Europe, especially. And there were other ones who were from Latin America or Asia. I pulled the ones that were cross Cold War lines. And there are many more. And I really hope that people will, who are scholarly people, will look into that, because this is a huge treasure trove that has not been explored for global science fiction. This is like a foundation of global science fiction. And he did all this with joy and with fun. He went to Japan before Americans thought it was okay to go there. He fell in love with Mothra, and he used to sing that little song of Mothra. And you mentioned Mothra, and go into the song. So they love him in Japan. They still remember him. There's a Japanese science fiction website with lots of tributes to Forry. Also Latin America. He went down to Rio, I think it was, for one of their first big South American conferences and conventions. So my way of summing him up is he was a joyful person, and people would come to his house where he would leave everything out, all of the stuff that he had, some of which was pretty valuable. People stole from him, but he, most of the really, really valuable he had hidden, but they took things, and he kept letting people come in and having an open house where everyone wasn't policed. That was the kind of person he was. And I just felt we have to dedicate this series to him. And here's the big news. As of 2016, he used to go and eat at House of Pies at Los Feliz. And we have eaten there with Forry a couple of times. And so the City Council of Los Angeles made it an official Forry Ackerman Square. And if you go to the square, you can look it up. You can go eat at House of Pies, and that's a tribute to Forry too. So we want to thank you, Forry. And now I'll stop and turn it over to our wonderful speaker, Sonja. Thank you, Sonja, so much for doing this.
Well, Gloria, thank you so much for that information, because that's always been, I started studying science fiction way back when I was, like 10 and saw Mothra, as you were mentioning, way back. But really started working on it because I was a child of the Cold War. In growing up, I was born, growing up in the 70s and the 80s, and really wanted to discover and study that other side that was always inaccessible. And so that's why I was so fascinated by German history, just in general, because of all of the challenges and contradictions, but also beauty and amazing, things that have come out of Germany. But also particularly interested in what were people like on the other side in East Germany. And what were their dreams? If we had, we were reading all these dreams and experiments in science fiction in the Western side. Well, what were they dreaming about? What were their alternate visions of the future? And that was really why I went into this. And so to be bringing this back through seeing now through Forry Ackerman and his outreach, that's really particularly meaningful. Just a little bit of more introduction for myself. It's fun. I always take it as a sign that I should have been working on science fiction, because I defended my dissertation at the University of Minnesota in 2001. That was not by design. That's actually how it happened. And as a matter of fact, I was actually studying together. Another graduate student there was the granddaughter of George Powell. And that was also kind of fun to find out. I am currently a professor at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. I'm an associate dean there as well. Gerry, thank you, said some about my involvement in the Science Fiction Research Association. And I've just been working in this area for a long time and really dedicating myself to trying to amplify the voices of all of the wonderful younger scholars who are working on science fiction from all over the world. It is a global phenomenon. It is a global genre, and it has its various manifestations of meaning making, right, in regional and local areas and in contexts. And I think particularly if you think about Forry and his vision, I think East German science fiction, and I'll start sharing my slides in a minute, is particularly interesting because they, if you think of just Germany in general, is at sort of a crossroads in Europe where you have the West and the East, of course, but much more traditionally, lots of migration through Germany, lots of ideas circulating there. And so the authors in Germany, and particularly even the East, were reading folks in the East and the West. And so you have this really interesting mix of ideas. So let me share my screen here. Hang on, hold on a second. Not, for some reason it was showing it up before, and now it's not easily finding it. I'm not quite sure. Just a minute.
Let's see what I can. I don't know if there's anything I can do on mine. It's
Yeah.
showing it. I ended mine, so it isn't still.
Yeah, I think what I just need to do is can you see it now?
Yeah, it's working now.
Yes,
Okay,
we can see it.
All right. So I'll go ahead and start here. And this is based on a talk that I gave, but I wanted to give some background first. And just to sort of locate Germany, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, in German Deutsche Demokratische Republik, that existed. It was founded after World War II, existed from 1949 to 1990. And you'll see here, I say wissenschaftliche, fantastische Literatur. I'm going to sprinkle German in the talk just so you can hear what the words are that they're using. That's scientific, fantastic literature. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The term science fiction is used, but much more scientific, fantastic. And you'll see here then East Germany is in the red. And then this is actually a wonderful map of the different occupational zones, right? Because West Germany was a conglomeration of the British sector, the American sector, and the French sector. And of course, East Germany was the Russian sector, the Soviet sector, that then were turned into countries. And of course, the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989. And then the country reunified on October 3rd in 1990. And as I was talking here, you have science fiction or science fantastic or science fantasy. Actually, there's a lot of the world that talks about their science fiction in terms of science fantastic and science fantasy. And it's a broader definition that's often including fantasy, fairy tale, where the science fiction, of course, that there have been lots of conversations about how that excludes that more fantastic. But there's more recently, of course, in the last 20 years, there's so much more intermingling of those. And I'm really thinking here in terms of how this is differentiated in the East, because you always had this background of this ideological warfare, right? And officially science fiction couldn't be published in East Germany because it was considered bourgeois, it was Western, it was capitalist. And that did also then impact the types of writing that could occur. Because if you're going to write in East Germany, you had to accept writing in a socialist world. This early on, really in the 50s and 60s, was much more near future, much more relying on on science, socialist realism, on scientific realism. So there were a lot of constraints there. But as you got into the later 60s, into the 70s, into the 80s, there was much more experimentation. As you know, if you think about the hard science fiction period kind of paralleling in the 50s and 60s, and then more of the social sciences and humanities coming in, on romanticism in the 70s and 80s. Romanticism is a loaded term too, so I want to, I'll talk about that in a little bit. But in particular in the West, the individual Western male hero savior was not necessarily really the type of hero you would see in the East. Time travel, jump gates, ray guns, bug-eyed monster, space opera, that did not appear in the East because, one, it was considered to be not really scientifically proven, and secondly, it wasn't allowed because the censors would censor it out and say that's too Western. Because of the influence of this long tradition of science fiction in Russia and Eastern Europe, Poland, if you go back into the 19th century, right, you have Russian science fiction, very revolutionary stuff. The science fiction in the East tends to often be much more philosophical because it's influenced by that tradition, but also with adventure. And then fairy tale fable, as you'll really see with Johann and Gunther Braun. So if I come to the next slide, this was then really originally, because Western science fiction was not published in East Germany, the genre was developed really without those discursive conventions originally. It's not, though, that authors weren't reading them, because the borders were porous, right? The authors, the fans would get copies. They would even make copies of copies, handwritten copies. Fan clubs would have libraries of Western science fiction. That was dangerous, ideologically dangerous, because it was discovered you could get into a lot of trouble, but they existed. But it was really, of course, influenced by Jules Verne, but really what allowed East German science fiction to exist was Yefremov's Andromeda from 1957. And that was published in Russia, was very popular, and that then created a precedent for more publishing in East Germany as well. And also, of course, Stanislaw Lem in Poland. So Yefremov and Lem then paved the way for the justification of more writers in East Germany to publish. Other influence, of course, you have Ursula Le Guin, by the way, was published in the East, and I've written an article on that if you want to know more about that. She was a really big influence. Boris and Arkady Strugatsky from Russia, Joseph Nesvadba, actually had the pleasure of meeting him once, and then many other Eastern influence as well as the Western. Very much not Hans Dominic, if you know that his writing from the early part of pre-World War II, not Wells, because he was considered to be what they weren't writing. And Kurt Laswitz, who was really writing early on in the 19th century, didn't really have as much of an influence as you might think. That's something I'd like to research a little bit more, but I think that would be interesting. So, and then in general, and I've said some things here already, but just the popularity of the GDR scientific, fantastic science fiction was banned under the National Socialists. So that's why they were really trying to imagine a new tradition to come out of that history that could not be fascism, because communism was viewed to be the only alternative post World War II, because the idea that you could never return to fascism, of course, and Nazism and the Holocaust. as I said, the GDR possessed a significant science fiction tradition because the West German titles were really competing with the translations of the UK and the United States. But the GDR authors weren't competing with that. And they had small runs of 20,000 copies, but those copies would be sold out immediately and were hard to get a hold of. Some Anglo-American texts became available in East Germany in the 70s and 80s. And what was really interesting is that the fan clubs were really key here in East Germany. And they've also become key post Wende, the post reunification. The fan clubs have become the publishers of science fiction. Hardy Kettlitz and his work, particularly the Gondola Verlag and some other, I could provide some more information on that if you're interested. And then really by 1990, some 151 novels, 6 science fiction anthologies published by the New Berlin, known as Lichtjahr. That was really what started me on my research. 12 children's books, 54 dime novels, 56 short story collections, lots and lots of other short stories in magazines and journals. And here's some of the names of some of the better known authors. Particularly Johann and Gunther Braun. You might have heard of Angela and Karl-Heinz Steinmüller. They are really the best known to have come out. And Erich Simon was he lives in Dresden, a very important editor and also has come into a much more of an author in his own right. You might have heard of Christa Wolf as well. She was probably the most famous author to come out of East Germany. She has written a story called Self-Experiment that's on gender swapping. It's a very 80s look at it, but it's an interesting story to read. And some other books you might look at her are Cassandra, which is more utopian, and also Accident or Sturmfall, which is about, that's really science, but it's about the Chernobyl accident and thinking about that. You might have, there are a number of East German films available. Most famous, and it has a fascinating East-West history to it, is Der Schweigende Stern, in the West known as Raumschiff Venus antwortet nicht, also known as the Silent Star. In the United States, First Spaceship on Venus. That's a completely different version, though, of the one that came out in East Germany. Signals, which is also the poster that I have behind me, that Eneo Meo, which were answers to 2001: A Space Odyssey, and also Tarkovsky's works. And then Joachim Helbig, there's a collective, a film collective, which is how the films were made. There, DEFA Futurum, which was, DEFA being the East German film studio, and Future produced a number of films, best known In the Dust of the Stars, which has some great disco music with it. And Love 2002 is also a short film. You'll see these are 70 millimeter, right? And that's important as well. So, and then after you get from the 50s and the 60s, which was really ideologically restrained, and that's not to say the 70s and 80s weren't, but you had the censors really didn't have a lot of literary training. They weren't really good at understanding metaphor. And so science fiction authors found, because the censors also didn't really take their genre seriously, that they could move their stories onto another planet and talk a lot about lots of things. And the censors didn't necessarily notice what they were talking about. So, I mean, it's much more complicated than that. But you had 2 major strains of science fiction. This experimental philosophical world building that's really fascinating. Angela and Karl-Heinz Steinmüller are still writing, and they're just wonderful authors. And if you could potentially even invite them to speak here. They do a great job of talking about their history in East Germany. Andimon, I think, is their best known work. I think it's really interesting to mention too, because they talk a lot about artificial intelligence in this book. And they were very much influenced by Ursula Le Guin, and the fan club in Berlin is named after Andy Mon. So I wanted to make a point of mentioning that. What I find also equally interesting is the satirical tradition that comes out of East Germany that's really also coming out of the East. And you see it a lot around the world, certainly also present in the United States. And I think it's very understudied. I think humor and science fiction is also very understudied. And that's there's some people working on that. This is why I wanted to talk about Johann and Gunther Braun. They were the generation before the Steinmüller, so they're about 10 years younger. Older, and really started writing children's books, and then moved more, and really fairy tales, and then moved more into science fiction. And so really, when you're thinking about science fantastic, you're having a lot going on here that I find very interesting. They were influenced by the German romantic author of the 19th century, E.T.A. Hoffmann. You might know him as the author of The Sandman, also The Nutcracker, and also an East German author you won't know, but I wanted to mention, Gerhard Brandsner is very much in the satirical tradition, and wrote The Star Cavalier from 1976, and then of course the Strugatskys as well. So that's why, and Johann de Gunther Braun, I think, just aren't very well known. Unfortunately, their work hasn't been translated a lot. I'll point out one short story that you can have access to a little bit later, but I think they're amazing. I think their science fiction is really fascinating. They were born in East Germany. I had the benefit of interviewing them in Schwerin, and I'm actually have had that transcribed, and I'm hoping to publish that along with this article on this book that they wrote. Yeah, I've said a little bit here. They wrote a total of 34 books and short stories. So they have a lot that they've written, and there's a lot there. And really writing from 1955 all the way up with Herr A. Morph, Mr. Morph came out in 1998. If you were authoring or writing and publishing in East Germany, you had to belong to the Writers' Union. That meant that you had to ideologically pledge that you would be writing in a certain way, right, to get published. They were members until 1982. There was a big shakeup in 1977 when a famous musician left for the West. And this started a great critique but also a crackdown of folks. And they just decided that they could no longer publish and really write in East Germany and write what they wanted to. So they published a book in 1981, and then the next one was published in the West in 1983 with Suhrkamp. Because once they left the Writers' Union, they couldn't publish in East Germany anymore. And you might know Suhrkamp is a really well-known German, then West German publisher. What's fun is that in the interview with them, they talked about how they had actually wrapped up one of their manuscripts as a Christmas package and had sent it ostensibly to relatives in the West. And it had made it, but they had sent it to the Suhrkamp publisher. They sort of disguised it to make it seem like it was a name, and that was where, that was where they were sending it to, and it got published. So that was a fun story. Oops, go to my next page. Here are some covers of some of their wonderful books. The first being Jose Cirilla's last bull, cow, or not cow, of course, bull opposite. I wrote on uncanny manifestations on Omega 11 in my book, East German Science Fiction Literature. If you're interested in reading more about that, there's a whole chapter devoted to that and the Browns. Some other stories here, The Mistake of the Great Magician, which is the second one, the Utofant Journal from 3000, and then I Am Time, Pascal, which are some others here. And then upper left is The Mistake Factor. And then you can see the changes in some of these are East German covers, some of these are West. The Transcendental Ball Plan, which is the upper middle. On the upper right is the hero who is duplicated X times. Here, Mr. Morph that I mentioned, and then Inaudible Tones. And so these are all titles of theirs. Again, all in German, but I'm hoping to write more so that they can become more accessible. And I'd love for them to be translated. I think they'd be amazing and really, really wonderful to read if they were translated, if someone's looking for that. So I wanted to talk specifically about one of their books, Convive Ludibundus. And that really is talking about play. And you can see here the East German cover, and then also the West German, which was retitled Professor Mittelswerks, which he's a character, and his beings is what that is called there. I need to just get to a place here where I can, sorry. So I'm going to just talk a little bit from a piece of what I wrote, and then I'll wrap up, and then we can have questions here. I also wanted to say that you probably have heard the name Darko Suvin. He has written an article on the Browns on their concept of playful cognizing, and that's partially where I draw from his work as well on this. So I'll just read a little bit. So as I said, Johanna and Gunther Braun developed their own playful and lightly satirical style of science fiction in the 70s and 80s. They are considered to have written some of the best science fiction stories from East Germany. Originally authors of children's literature, in the 60s, they became increasingly interested in German Romanticism. The Browns were intrigued by E.T.A. Hoffmann's use of the fantastic to reveal what Tsvetan Todorov terms, quote, ambiguities of meaning, unquote. These ambiguities become visible in that moment of uncertainty caused by an encounter with a fantastic element in the act of reading. An imaginary form, the fantastic allowed the Browns greater opportunities for expression than did the confines of realism, and specifically socialist realism. Experimenting with the fairy tale and fable, they incorporated science fiction's qualities of estrangement, allegory, satire, the uncanny, and the grotesque to warn of structural and environmental dangers present in the contemporary development of the GDR and of industrial societies in general. And that's why I think they're still very contemporary for our period, of course. It was in their children's literature that the Browns developed their distinctive narrative voice, which Darko Suvin describes as lightly satirical of contemporary social political issues. In a similar manner, their science fiction also retained this aspect of play. In the 60s, the Browns were influenced by writers Gerhard Brandsner, Stanislaw Lem, because he also wrote satirical science fiction, and Boris and Arkady Strugatsky, who increasingly incorporated elements of play in their science fiction with circular or timeless adventures, often to the point of the absurd. Rather than the linear narrative of successful expeditions, which brought about interstellar communist revolutions, these authors poked fun at the seriousness of such literature, as well as the institutions which supported it. Similar to the use of the uncanny, the Browns used elements of play and of the game to create a critical space in which they not only problematized contemporary representations of the quote-unquote truth by East German hegemonic ideology, but also proposed a corrective course of action. Darko Suvin has placed this playful cognizing in the tradition of the German Romantics and Brecht's Caucasian chalk circle, where, quote, serious power struggles, unquote, employ, quote, pencils, not pistols, unquote. The Browns employed playfulness as a means of repositioning truths in an alternate matrix for social ethical examination. Those readers who looked for the critical space presented by the Browns found a satire of bureaucracy, political figures, and day-to-day life, which helped them to comprehend and relativize their own situation. This was indeed one of the goals of the authors. And in their novel, Uncanny Manifestations on Omega 9, the character Mercure, or Mercury, addresses the reader at one point, advising her to, quote, never confuse the game with reality. In the game, you are the creator who controls everything. In reality, you must conform, but through practice, you have become able to see through this reality, unquote. The game is the, quote, reading process, unquote. However, in a manner similar to Hoffman, the Browns hope to employ this game in order to circumvent the censor and give the reader an opportunity to see a reality other than that provided by society at large. In their stories, the Browns often commented on ecological destruction, the government-sponsored type in the GDR, as well as beyond those borders. For instance, I have written elsewhere of their astute understanding of the association between environmental damage and class and racial conflict in Uncanny Manifestations on Omega-9. In what I'm talking about today, I turn to their later publication, Conviva Ludibundus, which can be seen as a sequel to the previously mentioned story. Of interest here are the single-celled bioelectronic ludibundi, known only to the esteemed and aging head sea gardener, Professor Philemon. And that's, of course, a biblical reference. He discovered them by accident via a malfunctioning calculator in the story and has what Suvin has termed a, quote, tacit, gardener-like understanding of the conviva's needs and nature, unquote. Philemon has continued to speak with them in this magical mathematical way for over 40 years. Humans and the cryptic ludibundi are in a symbiotic relationship in that the latter produce what are known as green medallion mussels, a culinary delicacy which fulfill all of the nutritional needs of a human from the third millennium. Under Philemon's direction, humans harvest 50% of the mussels, and the ludibundi consume 50% of the sea garden's yield, so they're sharing. Conflict ensues when the vain, career-driven, media-savvy super scientist, Professor Dr. Hans H. Mittelswerk, from the Society for the Evaluation and Development of Food, intervenes to hunt down the mussel thieves, or Muschelräuber, he is quote-unquote discovered in the garden, and maximize the mussel harvest to 100%. Philemon, the narrator of the story, describes Mittelswerk as what's known as a Fleiß-Strebe-Aufstiegswesen. And I have that that word, actually I can just, you'll see it in the middle there. He is a typically dour, unimaginative, hardworking, upwardly mobile, conscientious, vain, and pompous, assiduo-aspiring ascendance entity is how that Suvin translates that. In an allusion to Solaris, Mittelswerk initially tries to attack the as yet unknown mussel thieves via staccato tones that will destroy their sense of orientation. Instead, Mittelswerk's widely lauded technological superior machinery and know-how drive the ludibundi from their home and destroy the entire mussel harvest in the process. The rest of the book charts Mittelswerk's voyage to hunt down, in the latest super ship, the Total Mobile 1, to hunt down the mussel thieves and bring them to justice. When he finds them, Mittelswerk attempts first to harness the ludibundi as objects for scientific purposes, and then later to restart and maximize green mussel production. These attempts both backfire, and the second leads to the envelopment of himself, Mittelswerk, and the ship in a great pool of green mussel slime. So he gets slimed, basically. So my current project focuses on the subject of human-animal communication as portrayed in the science fiction novel Conviva Ludibundus. The Animal and Society Institute defines human-animal studies as, quote, a rapidly growing interdisciplinary field that examines the complex and multidimensional relationships between humans and other animals, unquote. In the field of literature, certainly this society can find no better form than science fiction. This genre's reason of being is the exploration of alterity through the use of the novum to estrange the reader from her known world. Science fiction is able to imagine the animal in ways that realist fiction cannot. And in her book, Animal Alterity, Cheryl Vint argues, quote, animals in science fiction can return to us a face-to-face encounter with another being whom we regard as a fellow subject, unquote. Certainly, all literature is limited by the abilities of its human authors to articulate an animal sensibility. Many scholars, including Timothy Morton, have argued that Stanislaw Lem made this point very well in Solaris. Yet besides direct scientific attempts to understand and even communicate with animals on their own terms, the poetic mode presents the best alternative method to anticipate animal voices and recognize animal agency in a form that more humans might understand. So on the one hand, Conviva Ludibundus by the Browns provides a critique of scientific instrumentalism, a theme often found in their work. Not unlike other East German authors of the time, the Browns turned to the German Romantics, here specifically E.T.A. Hoffmann, and his use of the uncanny to problematize contemporary representations of truth. Although their novel certainly targeted a specific East German problematic of the 70s, it also participated in a discourse on the shortcomings of the Enlightenment that crossed East-West borders. In Conviva Ludibundus, this examination manifests itself as a loss of human creativity and critical thought, caused by one-dimensionality, over-rationality, technology mania, and I have in parentheses, male hubris. Play or playfulness provided the counterweight to an over-reliance on reason with a capital R that can be taken to excess. As D.W. Winnicott demonstrated in Playing in Reality, play is that most creatively productive of activities, which is central to adult emotional and psychological well-being. In Conviva Ludibundus, the very elemental human act of learning to play with a being other than the self leads to an opening in the possibility for interspecies understanding, and also a further exploration of what it means to be human in the process. In the book, the only human character capable of initiating this type of productive contact is the artist Frau Friederike Kutzenbacher. She is an actress, singer, and painter. In the novel, it is her erstwhile boredom with a patriarchal reality of East Germany, her own creative curiosity, and drive to self-actualization through performance that leads to progress in communicating with the story's other, the beings of genus Conviva Ludibundus, or playful boon companion, which is how Suvin translates that. The Browns ultimately champion the arts and humanities through play as ways in which humans and animals might begin to connect without spoken language. Through an analysis of Friedrich Schiller's concept of Spieltrieb, the drive to play, Bertolt Brecht's definition of scientific play, and Maria Lugonis's world traveling through play, I then, in my essay, which I will wrap this up now because I don't have time to go into this, but I hope through those, hope to begin to provide a definition of play that appears in many of the Browns' works. And here then is a favorite quote of mine from the latter part of the book that I will end with. This is Friederike Kutzenbacher. She says, and this is my translation, "Everything is tried out, played through, everything transforms itself. Whether something beautiful or ugly results is not important. The transformation is what is important. And while the Conviva Ludibundus constantly transforms itself, therefore I have the desire to play with him. It's not really, it's gendered somewhat, all of these one cell creatures. But not necessarily. It doesn't have to be that. So I have the desire to play with him, to paint him in many variations, to write a song about him. Maybe there are many other possibilities there. Maybe he could produce great art precisely while he is a great transformer. I just want to play with him a bit. His name is Ludibundus, the one who plays." Thank you very much. Oh, I did, hold on. Here is a short story that is in English from Johanna Gunther Braun in The Black Mirror and Other Stories, and just glossed who Friedrich Schiller was, living in the 19th century. And then I came up with a list of German reading suggestions in English that I thought might be interesting. And just for the recording, there is a German science fiction short stories, 10 short stories written in German with English that came out, English translations that came out in 2024 by Sebastian Coutinho. That is all of, I think is very interesting. Dietmar Datt is a very current, very popular philosophical author in Germany. His Abolition of Species is available in English. You might have read Andreas Eschbach's The Carpet Makers. That made a big splash when it came out in 2013. Of course, Kurt Lasowitz. 19th century, here there's a publisher called Bermuda World Hyperlearn that's taking lots of stories and translating them with the German and English right next door, right side by side. And they've translated Kurt Lasowitz, The Zero Point of Existence. So that I think might be interesting. The Black Mirror, which I just mentioned by Franz Rottensteiner, who is a very well-known name in German science fiction, and Mike Mitchell. Angela and Karl-Heinz Steinmüller have short stories here, as well as the Browns. Franz Schätzing's The Swarm, you might know. That's a very fascinating and dystopia about climate change, very well scientifically researched. And then I think there are so few women writing, but I have to talk about Judith Vogt. She's amazing. She writes with Christian Vogt as well, and she has a novel that's been translated, Roma Nova, a space opera, and that just came out. And I just want to really recommend her work too. So, okay, then that's everything I have here. Would love
you did a wonderful, wonderful job of opening the kinds of windows, and I hate to lean on him again, that Forry Ackerman was always opening, and in a much more, I'd say, scholarly. Forry was heavy on enthusiasm. He was a collector, but this is the real deal of scholarship. And I know that Karl Čapek fit a lot of the categories that you were bringing up. And I'm sure that someone, and I just joined the Comparative Literature Association, and I may not do it in what I have left in this lifetime, but I think there are a lot of overlaps that now that we're not divided the way we had been, that can be explored in satire and all of that. There's a whole genre of mermaid stories in Czech literature that they did a lot of social satire via mermaids. So just an example. Okay, so we are crossing many boundaries, and as a social activist, that's what I'm about in my other group that I belong to, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And so I think I will open it up to, first, people didn't get a chance to all, in a couple sentences, you can unmute your sound and start your videos. Just tell us who you are. And I don't know, I'll call on people like a teacher if I have. James, are you here? James? Madden? Hello, James.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Do you want to just say in a couple sentences who you are and your interest in science fiction?
I'm an old guy. I read science fiction much less than I used to, and just like to listen in on what I would call current thought.
Good, very good. Okay, let's see who came in next. I can't remember, but I'll go to Elizabeth because she's far away. Elizabeth Grajewski came to us from Hamburg. So
yes, on the invite of fine Gloria. Hope you're well too. It was really interesting. To be honest, the only science fiction I ever followed was Douglas Adams and Doctor Who. So I feel like a fish out of water, but it's very interesting, especially what you said about East Germany. Of course, I know Christa Wolf. I will definitely look up some of these people or try to get the book. Now, what would interest me, this couple, Johanna and Günther Braun, did they remain in the GDR?
Yes, they did. They did.
Okay.
They were in Schwerin.
Okay.
And were there until their deaths, right? So, yeah, so they stayed there. So there were a number of people who actually left physically to live in, but they stayed. They were publishing. in the West,
Okay.
but they stayed. Mhm.
Okay, interesting. And their books have all been translated or not?
No,
no,
I would say none of them have been translated.
none of them.
No,
Okay.
that's why I think that they are very undiscovered. And
Okay.
really, I've been doing some other projects, but am coming back to them because I've always thought that I was actually kind of waiting for people to work on them, but that hasn't happened.
Okay.
But yeah, their works are readily available in German. And
Okay.
there is that the Black Mirror, that book has one of their stories in it. So I can't, that the Black Mirror is a great collection. It's Austrian and German translated into English. It's a great overview. And Rottensteiner and his co-author really know their stuff in that area and did a good job.
Okay. Okay,
Okay,
wonderful.
Max.
I'll
Okay.
spread the word too.
Oh, good. We
Yeah.
need that. And
Okay.
we had a comment from Cairo just a second ago. I wanted not slight Cairo. Imad, could you repeat that? It was in the chat about the
Yeah.
Soviet science fiction.
Yeah, it's a quote from the book I did with McFarland. It's an interview of Hamid Ismailov, a Uzbek author. And he's done a little science fiction, but he knew some big science fiction writers from Central Asia. And he explained that in the Soviet Union, SF was considered to be distractive literature, not subversive literature. So you could seen as you just distract people from their daily lives. And SF authors use that as a way of getting around criticism and critiquing society. And the Boris and Arkady Strugatsky. And he even said, even today, if you look at postmodernist literature in Russia, the old science fiction stuff is better. It's more ahead of its time.
Very, very informative. This is something I was wondering, Imad, might you be available in December to speak about, the world of Cairo and science fiction? It's the first Saturday in December.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, we can talk. Put your email in just in case I don't have the correct one, and in the chat, and I'll copy it. Okay, so we have Hugh Hudson, who's going to be speaking. Let me check the date. I'm introducing Hugh. Hello, Hugh. I think you're going to be giving a talk yourself. Where is it? You are scheduled for November. Hugh, are you there?
Okay. I'm there.
Okay.
Hello.
Hello, Hugh.
This is the very first time that I'm signing in here, so it's all new for me. I'm a fish out of water.
Well, you're certainly not going to be in November when you're the speaker. So it's good that you did a trial run. I wish all of our speakers would come at least once before they, do their own talk. So if they have enough notice, sometimes they don't. Okay, so Hugh, where are you?
I'm in Glasgow, Scotland.
Okay, so we have another non-Western Hemisphere person here. And are you a writer yourself? I think you're also an academic.
No, I'm a scientist. I'm an astrophysicist, and so my link here. I'm not sure why I'm here, but I read science fiction universally when I was, let's say, 20 years old, something like that.
Oh, Hugh, I know why you know about us, because we have you scheduled to speak.
Well, no, that's right. I don't know how we got together, but I'm glad we did. And
I hope you know that this won't come as too big a surprise. Okay.
So I think I sent you an email telling you my background. Heinlein, Bradbury, Asimov, all of those old timers. I think the last a gasp of my science fiction reading career was Ayn Rand. I read Atlas Shrugged, and I shrugged. So I said, I don't want this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, but however, what I'm going to talk about in November is this solar flare events, and I would sort of like to follow in the footsteps of Kip Thorne, and he's a famous scientist, and he's an advisor to the movie industry for disaster movies, and so there are quite a few disaster movies about the sun and solar flares and catastrophes of that sort. And I'm in my scientific life, I'm working on what we call extreme events, to a certain extent. I mean, how can we anticipate what the sun might do that is a disaster? And so I would talk about that if I could.
Well, whatever, you're
For
on.
background, I'm gonna try to watch all the disaster movies that I can. That's my plan.
That will keep you busy.
That'll keep you busy.
So I'm gonna go to next. I'm going back to our where I am located, Tucson, to Alice Wittenberg and Greg Evans, and Greg has a direct tie to Yosef Nesvadva.
Yeah, I do. I've done did the webpage for him. I've translated well, just the interview for him, but I've also had I work as a Czech translator from Czech into English, and for the Philosophical Institute, Czech Academy of Sciences, Charles University, and so on. And I've done a variety of. I've translated Jana Mordovsova, for instance, a story by her into Czech, from Czech into English. She was a well-known science fiction writer of the 70s and 80s. And yeah, I got a few comments actually later on about some of the things, very interesting things we talked about. But that's just by way of introduction. And I'm also a writer and so on. But lifelong, not primarily a science fiction writer, but I've definitely written science fiction. More working out of the Franz Kafka tradition as a writer of fiction, but still very much science fiction. But I'll have more to say. I got a couple of points later.
I think that you ought to get together with Sonja, because this is where that interaction, and I'm starting to understand all this Germans over here, Czechs over here, ain't true, and more of it will come out. So I think that will be a very interesting interaction. Maybe you can exchange emails in chat or something. Okay, so our next person that just came in is Alvaro. Let me get the whole name here.
Okay.
Sousa. Could you introduce yourself, please, and where you're at, where you are?
That's okay.
Alvaro.
From Vila do Conde in Portugal.
Oh, now we got Portugal. Yeah.
Yes.
So how did you hear about this, since you're a first timer?
This new in Facebook, and I'm a science fiction fan since I have 12 years. Write some science fiction and fantasy short stories.
Wonderful. Well, we welcome you here for your first time, and I hope you'll spread the word and keep coming, because we truly want to be a global group, and today we actually are. Think of all the countries represented in this meeting. Okay, with all that, without any more hoopla from me, what are your questions for either of our speakers? Would you like to ask or comment, do anything? Oh, maybe you should raise your hands in case there's a big rush. I see a hand. I see Greg.
Yeah, I had sort of 2 points. First of all, I did look up the Browns. It was interesting to look them up on the Národní knihovna, the National Library database catalog in Czechoslovakia, the former Czechoslovakia. And I was curious to see that they were never translated into Czech. That was surprising, because many science fiction authors were. It looked like there was the only translation I could see was one into Hungarian, published in Bratislava in 1986, which was even after they'd stopped publishing in East Germany. Just a curiosity. But probably more my question or the point that I wanted to make was the thing, because we brought up the question what the role of the censor and that kind of thing. And I've written for and translated for and edited for a publication called Contradicta, which is a publication that sort of explores, it's tried to sort of re-examine what was going on in the communist states and everything from a more sophisticated point of view, or more seeing them as not just being a single sort of monolithic block. And they had 2 issues ago. We had an issue where it was about ecology in the East Bloc, and it struck me that because we were talking about the censor. Well, I mean, there's currents going on within the East German government. Because one of the articles was about 3 different factions within the East German government, and how they were going to react to and how to handle the ecological crisis. That was to be seen. That was apparent. That the government couldn't really deny there's something going on here. And there were various factions within the East German government, also within the Czechoslovak government, and so on. And I was just wondering if that ever ties in with some of the reading or some of the science fiction, because again, I'm just trying to say that the role of censorship and so on isn't just a censor that maybe missed things, but there's also ideological currents going on within the governments themselves, that so some things get through because somebody thinks it should get through, even within the East German government, just because they think we need to do more about this. I just want to say one last point would be the novel by Vladimir Paral, a very famous official Czech writer, who published in the 1980s, published a book about Ústí nad Labem, which is right across the border from Germany. Of course, they had a huge that was where the acid rain was the worst, smog, and it was the war with the multi-beast, where the smog becomes an intelligent life form. It starts to influence people and take over their lives. And I mean, anyway, I just was going to ask you that if you're aware of that, or what those factions and so on, or.
Could you put the name of that story in the chat? Because I would love to read that. I've heard of that story, but I haven't ever read it. The one with the smog that you were just talking about.
Okay.
I'm so excited you brought up the Czech influence, because I think it's great. I think that, also just as you were talking about that whole tradition, then even thinking too, I've done quite a bit with Czech film, so I know the new wave more than I do some of the stories. But just in general, I think your first point about the transnational connections just in the East are fascinating. I think it would be an interesting project to really take a look at who was translated when and why across the East Bloc. I can say that in East Germany, the translations were very much Russian early on, because they were trying to, but very careful about Russian, but trying to fill a gap that they knew was there, but didn't know how to fill it ideologically, following, particularly in the 50s. Because there was a conversation that science fiction shouldn't belong in East Germany for a while. The censor, absolutely, I want to just underscore everything you said about it being a very, I mean, you can't say the censor. There are many censors. There's an entire apparatus of that. One of the wonderful things about studying East Germany and Germany in general is that the Germans have always kept incredible records. So if you can go to the both the National Film Archive in Berlin, and also there's the Federal Archive, the Bundesarchiv, that has a couple of different places in Germany that you can go to. The GDR records are in Berlin, and you can go look at all of the writing on the publication of the books that came out. So for instance, one part of the research that I did was spend quite a bit of time in the Federal Archive looking at the justification reports for publication. Why should this book be published? And quite often you would have maybe the editor who wanted to publish it in the series. So the major series were the New Berlin Publishers and New Life Publishers. And New Life Publishers was associated with the Free German Youth. So you had different types of things that could be published in those places. There was an editor in the late 60s named Eckhard Bredlin, who was able to make enough arguments through justifications of publication to create this more of a series, a publishing series in the New Berlin Publishers. And it was through those documents. The early ones in the 60s, they're pretty thick because there's a lot of back and forth, right, in those. And you can watch those very conversations that you're talking about. Why should we publish this? Well, it's bringing about the correct mentality to our youth, right? We need to have more of there are phrases like Marxist Leninist type of mentality, or we need to provide positive future visions for the youth. We need to, so it's really very party language. that, I call it official bureaucratic party language. So what Redline was doing, and I also had the great fortune to be able to interview him before he died. That was a wonderful thing because he was in his 80s. And he told me about that history and that he was able to carve out a space saying, well, Lem has published this, and this is what Lem does, right? And that's why I was mentioning the Yefremov. This is what's going on in the Soviet Union. And because they have published like this, and that's what these stories are doing, these other stories that we want to publish in the East are like their stories in these ways. But what's fascinating is, and then Eric Simon also then would become an editor there as well. As there was this back and forth. Is this an okay genre? Is this not an okay genre? And it would ebb and flow, with the various freezings and thawings of what was going on. Really in 72 with the new, with Erich Honecker coming to power, he decided that there needed to be more popular literature that was being produced in the East because so much was coming over from the West. And I forgot to mention earlier, in most of East Germany, they could get West German television and radio. So they had access to that. The Saxony did not usually. That was called the Valley of the clueless, the Tal der Ahnungslosen, because they didn't have access to the West. But a lot of East Germany was actively, quote unquote, ideologically fighting Star Trek and, Star Wars and whatever was screened. I mentioned Hardy Kettlitz in the chat, and he was a fan and is now an important publisher for German science fiction, and his memoranda publishers, and he's also been involved with Gokongda, but they've done a lot of secondary material, but also are continuing to publish fiction. He says his first experience with science fiction, he grew up in Berlin, East Berlin, was not East German science fiction. It was Star Trek on television. So you always have to think that these conversations were always thinking about, okay, how are we combating, quote unquote, combating the science fiction? But Eric Simon and Redline, they were playing the game too. I talk about playing a game. I look at, if you can go and look at the justifications for publication for a lot of the novels that were coming out in the 70s and 80s, because of, I think, partially Honecker saying we need to produce more, there was this mandate to produce more. And there was a lot less that was contested. And Simon sort of learned the phrases to put in there, and that would be approved. But you read this justification that he wrote, and then you read the story, and you're like, are we talking about the same two books? They're completely. It's really fascinating. I mean, and I've written a little bit on that in my book about sort of how to use discourses, right? And the readers were reading between the lines, and it wasn't always critiquing the system. A lot of it was, just having conversation in this other space. I mentioned way at the beginning, talking about, I was interested in the dreams on the other side of the Iron Curtain. And that's what's so interesting to me is, yeah, I can talk about, the politics, but ultimately, it's much more interesting to bring in these transnational conversations. And what's the European vision? A lot of it is on ecology and environmental destruction, which was going on, all in the East, all over the place, but also in the West. So to get back to that aspect. So that's a long answer, but there's so much that could be done. There are some graduate students who are rediscovering this, and I'm working with them, and I'm so excited because I'm trying to point them to folks and who they can talk to, and then also, all the influences, but they have to have the language. right? So
Yeah.
there's one, if there's some people who know Czech and German, that gets to be a wonderful benefit. I just know German. I don't know, and I know Spanish and French, right? I mean, I'm from the West, right? So I wish I had taken a Slavic language, because I think that would have opened up doors for me that I just didn't have the time. But that's a great combination.
Thank you.
Any
Yeah.
more thoughts or comments? Yes, we were discussing in private emails about all the things coming out in Czech Republic, especially on Kafka, whose 100th anniversary of departing this vale of tears happened, I think, in June. And they put out a
June 3rd, actually. June 3rd.
Yeah, he was there.
I was there, yeah.
You were there when they put out the video? There's
I saw the first two
6-part
episodes of the TV series. Yeah, I
I
saw the
mean, the
documentary on
TV.
TV. It was quite an incredible thing,
I
actually.
want to explain to people how they can access it, though, in this meeting. It is not hard to find, and if you want it, I can give you the link to the whole series. And you might, for those who don't speak Czech at all, there's a way to switch the soundtrack over to German, which many more people in this part of the world speak than Czech. And I was having fun going blip, 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 back and forth. I'm going to watch all of them in Czech after I watch all of them in German. So, I mean, that level of mixing now is going on, which is totally not being recorded in our mass media here in the West. It's just not being recorded. We still have this image of world drops off at Vienna. Nothing there. Dragons are beyond this, And I get so tired of that, because it never has been like that. And in fact, for the rest of the world too, it never has been like that. And I was discussing with Egyptian films, they were very cosmopolitan with Imad. So we're going to make a stab, that's kind of violent sounding, a start at moving in that opposite direction to show we're not looking for walls, we're looking for people being created and how they intermarry. One of the big ways that this happens is through intermarrying all the way back. We know this from medieval times where they would have state marriages. Well, I mean, people intermarry into those other groups. There's kind of a grim film, maybe the two of you may know it, Greg and Sonja. It's called Marketa Lazarova. Does that ring a bell? Marketa Lazarova. And it's the funniest. It's very dismal. If you see it, it's the grubbiest medieval film you'll ever, and it undercuts everybody's glorious mythic beginning of their society. It's this group of Germans, and they're encountering these brigand Czechs, and it's made by a Czech, but you'd never know it by the way they're all treated. I don't want to give away any of it, but it completely shows that it's the exchanges of women, male exogamy fear, the fear that one of your women is going to get out of the corral and go mate with one of them, that's really behind a lot of this. But that film would be worth having some discussion within either the peace groups or whatever. But Marquette, it's one of the new wave, I think, in the Czech Republic. Marketa Lazarova. I think they screamed because it made them all look like grubby pigs instead of these wonderful, in velvet medieval characters. So there's a lot to be done, and it's all in whether you're looking for walls or looking for connections. Any other, I mean, that was a little riff off me, but go ahead, Greg.
I just have one more question for Sonja. Did you notice any, when I came to the Czech Republic, or when we came to the Czech Republic, actually in the early and mid 90s, I partially went hoping to discover a science fiction world that was still very much in the Stanislav Lem, Boris Strugatsky. Of course, we talk about the Czech Republic, Yaroslav Weiss, Josef Nesved, Jan Moravcova, that's sort of, merging obviously with Western science fiction coming in, but still, and unfortunately I didn't find much of that. It seemed like the sort of East Bloc era science fiction already we went to a science fiction sort of Prague science fiction convention, or not convention, but sort of meeting or something. And there's a bookseller there, and I asked, "Oh, do you have any books by Jaroslav Weiss or something by Paral and so on?" And he just sort of looked at me and said, "Well, maybe you could find it in a used bookstore." I mean, they weren't selling really those books very much. And I even a kind of horrible thought, the horrible thing was in Ikaria, the Czech science fiction magazine, in 19, this is in the summer of '96 issue. They were even sort of writing, look, we have a Czech section where we publish Czech stories, and we have a world section. And when there's so many Czech writers were writing in using English pseudonyms, that they said, please don't do that because it confuses our categories here. And because again, there seemed to be, at least at that time, there's sort of a wave of sort of like trying to sort of be like they perceived Western science fiction to be. So I was wondering how that played out in East Germany, or did it, or?
Yeah, I think, and thanks. That's a great question and a very important aspect. I think that's a lot due to what happened to the economic systems, right? I mean, after the fall of the wall, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, you had before books were well, first of all, there was a shortage of paper in general in East Germany. I would think that in other places in the East as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
So there was that. So there was higher quality versus lower quality, but the publications were subsidized, and they also were protected from the Western market, just the sheer overwhelm of numbers of books, right, coming from the West. And with reunification, we're really with really November 9th, right? I mean, a lot of things were collapsing then, that all disappeared. And so all of these publishers went out of business, first of all, because they just couldn't compete. They didn't have the names, and just the demand dropped greatly. That was really part of it, was that the readership immediately said, well, we have access to all of these other books now. Why should we continue to read what we've been reading when we can get all of these other names that we've always wanted to have access to? And, unwittingly, I think, created some, put a lot of people out of business. Unfortunately led to some suicides, right, at this time too. I mean, that's I think an untold story. And it's very tragic in some way. Of course, that is always tragic, but and then when I mentioned Hardy Kettlis's Memoranda Verlag and the publisher there, I say that also to say that he is managing to keep this going, right? He is producing books by German authors. Heine has also done that in the past. But you mentioned that authors would take English sounding pseudonyms. Well, that was because they thought that they would get purchased more because, people would think they were British or American. So it's really difficult to find that niche, it's a niche within a niche within a niche. There was one other thing that just came to my mind and just left that I know you mentioned, but maybe it'll come back and I can't remember, darn it. I don't know the Czech authors as much as I would like. I switched to film, science fiction film, because of my language challenge. I've watched a lot of Eastern European film on YouTube. This was before streaming became really much easier. That doesn't make sense, but it was before the Eastern films became much more easily accessible. But I was watching them early on because there was some folks in South America who were subtitling them with Spanish. And so in that also brings in another aspect to this that we haven't talked about, but the migration, of course, down to South America, Central and South America. And Gloria mentioned, the migration from to the U.S. after World War II. Well, of course, it was also Mexico, Central South America, and those folks were keeping those connections. I think many of you might know that the most perfect, complete form of metropolis was found in Argentina, and that's why we have that. So.
Yes, that's very important. And as I say, Forry was down there digging around way back before people knew these connections, and he was forging. Forry was forging some of them. And also, I tried to do a book, and I told you about it, called Planet Europa SF. But you learn, even though that didn't find a publisher, I made a lot of friends across 22 countries in Europe, including Christian Thomas. Does that name ring a bell? He used to edit the web page of all science fiction news. I think it was called Planet Europa or something.
Yes,
Should we come up to here?
yes. He was
You know,
Romanian. Was he
Yes,
Romanian?
Romanian. Yeah.
Absolutely
It-
know him. Yeah, it was great.
So he was doing this work, I think even before the wall fell on paper and, through fanzines, but certainly after the wall fell or after the technology became available. And I asked him, because I was asking each of them what they thought is the situation, and this is over 22 countries, I had answers. And he said, kind of the most coherently, he said that it's sort of like in our European and especially Balkan Eastern, we view the United States as a neutron star. We all get sucked up into it, and we don't get to know each other until that neutron star spits us out, because English is the language that they all can read, and they can't all read Bulgarian or each other's languages. And he said, so if you're not taken up by the neutron star, it much limits your availability to your European cohort. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And if I can add, I think what's going on now as well, and this gets back to the project that Gerry was talking about on defining world science fiction, is we've had a very narrow definition of what science fiction is. And, thinking about Egyptian contributions and, Northern Africa, just really there are whole areas of the world that have amazing stories that we would be capturing and bringing into this discourse if we just talk about speculative fiction, we talk about futurisms, if we talk about science fantastic, that then broadens the conversation to bring in these other voices, which I think is super, super important. And I'm so excited, Imad, that
I'm
you're
excited for you, and that you're excited, because I've been spinning my wheels, very frustratingly over these things for decades. And I think that one of the reasons for war is that we think of walls between cultures. And you know who Bela Bartok was, the famous composer. He began writing Romanian lullabies, and he was an ethnomusicologist who traveled from country to country. You had a lot of Hungarians who were very nationalistic, and they would do Hungarian folk themes, in their music. And he did the one that was the biggest enemy country in the 1930s because of the transfers of territory. They hated Romania, basically, in Hungary at that time, because they'd taken Transylvania away from them. And so here's Bela Bartok having a whole cycle of Romanian lullabies. And he said, in his view, culture is like a stream. As you get close to the levels where people are starting to be more of the other guy, it's like that thins out. You get kind of a borderlands language that's a mix, and then it gets more and more strong. It's not a thing with walls between each national group. And he said, any source that is authentic, I will use, and I don't care what country it's from. And I love that about him. So, there are people in these various eras that are very divided, very looking at one askance if one is even interested in this other place. But we shouldn't let that get us down.
No, absolutely not. And constantly, one of my most fun things to do is read science fiction from a country that I don't know very well. And I'm thinking about, all of the Spanish and dystopian traditions. There've been some great films that have been based on some of those works. And I don't know Portugal contributions as well, but I know they're there. They have to be there. I don't know, Alvaro, if you want to talk to that a little bit. Sorry to put you on the spot there. And if you don't want to, that's fine.
I don't know, is Alvaro with us at the moment? Sometimes people are still logged in, but they're not.
Yeah.
And I see that we may be losing Greg.
The Portuguese science fiction, it's almost all time in a ghetto of literature. The Academy don't recognize the Portuguese science fiction. There are no seminars or communications, academic communications about science fiction. So the Portuguese science fiction exists, but there are only a few authors, and the production is very low. And there are almost none translations for other languages. I'm with a great flu, so I'm difficult to me to speak.
Yeah, no, I know that's so frustrating. I get so frustrated with that sentiment, you know, in there. That's true in many European countries. It's just an inability to recognize the high quality conversations going on when science fiction is just called pejoratively entertainment literature, right? I know that Brazil has, you know, some. At least our colleague Alfredo Supia works on the film and science fiction film in Brazil and Latin America. So there might be some cross cultural conversations there. I'm just not sure.
Now, the Brazilian is a very large market. So there are a lot of science fiction writers in Brazil, and some of them have translations in other languages, including English. So it's a completely different reality because of the size. Portugal is a very small country. Brazil, it's a very big country. So this is very important to make the difference in this case. I have contacted in the last 15 years, 50 years about people, science fiction writers and scholars in almost of the world. And the Brazilian is very different from Portugal. The acceptation and the bookseller market, it's very large. In Portugal, it's very that you can comprehend better. In Portugal, they are publishing one novel for a year in a good year.
Yeah, no, that's why I was thinking about how that is in Spain, but of course that's also a different language there as well.
No, Spain is very different.
Yeah.
I know very well the Spanish science fiction and the writers and the editors, and the scale is completely different. It's they have lots of science fiction writers. The science fiction is considered as literature in Spain. Some faculties and universities have courses about science fiction. In Portugal, there are none.
Yeah.
It's a very different reality.
There's the German Literary Archive is having a conference in November called, I'm sort of translating, that's focusing on the differences between what they're calling entertainment and literature. And I've been invited to that, and I'm very excited to be able to talk about that topic. And they just to kind of, you know, say, can we just move beyond that because it's not really productive. And I've heard that the German literary archive is going to start collecting science fiction. So I wanted to ask more about that. This is the one in Marbach, which is close to Stuttgart. So I'm excited about that and eager to find out that maybe that's, you know, shifting some of the conversations there. I do also want to say that there's amazing work coming out on Asian, as well. Ahmad put a great reference to Arab and Muslim science fiction, a edited collection on that in the chat. That's such a momentous publication because that's been understudied. I'm so excited about that. And Ahmad, thank you for helping to edit that because it's really, really.
I'm just asking Ahmad if
pleasure.
he might be available in December to speak on this. Sorry.
I think so. Yes, I think.
That'd be wonderful. You can do the whole thing. You know, it's December
Okay.
7th.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
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 Yeah,
Yes,
so
please. Yes.
yeah, it's on my calendar, and I'll make sure to come to that because that'll be really interesting.
Wonderful. I have someone, but she seems to be traveling and not that able to do December, so I'm just going to let her off the hook and replace her. That's what happens. If you're on the airplane, you get replaced. All right. So with that happy news that we have Ahmad for December, and hopefully all of you will stay tuned to further adventures. Any other final words, or shall we get on to our lunch or whatever meal it is where you are?
I'd just like to say thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. I think Gerry, I can speak for Gerry too, that we're just both thrilled to find out more about your group. Love talking with authors, and very important group to be working with. So anytime you're interested in reaching out, please do so.
Oh, I will. And our goal, thank you, both of you. Our goal is exactly what you're doing. I mean, we have this tremendous technology and people use it to talk over the fence to their next door neighbors. We need to be, reaching out, really. So, okay, so now I guess that's good news all the way around, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much for this international group participation. We'll see you next time. Oh, let me say who next is. Next is, I believe, get it right here. My mind is a sieve, you realize. This is September, so next is October, and that is Andy Duncan. Andy Duncan will be speaking, I believe, on recovering pseudoscience and using it in science fiction. It should be interesting. So thank you very much. Have a good rest of your
I know an expert on pseudoscience.
Okay, well, bring them. Have them come for that
Okay.
one.
Yeah.
All
And I
right.
put up a link for a German-French movie in English.
Okay,
science
sure.
fiction.
Oh, and don't forget, look at
It's
the
on
three
your-
dots, save chat, everybody. I'll do it myself. Get into chat. You have to get in chat. And then at the bottom or at the top, you will see three dots. And one of the choices is save chat. Okay, I'm saving chat. Hope you're all saving chat. I'll try to remember to send out the chat. And now I'm going to say goodbye. See you next time.